Hello, my friend. Come, sit for a while. The day is done. The stars are beginning to prick the deep velvet of the sky, and it's the perfect time for a story. It's a tale from a long, long time ago, a time of wandering kings and desert encampments, of foolish men and wise women. It's a story about how a single act of kindness, a single moment of wisdom, can change the course of history. It is the story of a woman named Abigail. Our story begins not with a celebration, but with a profound and heavy silence. It fell first upon a man, and from him it spread like a shroud over 600 of his followers and their families. The man was David, son of Jesse. You may have heard of him. The shepherd boy who faced a giant, the musician who soothed a troubled king, the warrior beloved by the people. But at this moment in our story, he was not in a palace. He was a fugitive, hiding in the rugged wilderness, his heart a hollow ache within his chest. The news had traveled on the wind, carried by merchants and shepherds from the hills of Ramah. It was a simple, stark message. Samuel was dead. For most of Israel, this was the passing of an era. Samuel was the last of the great judges, the prophet who had anointed their first king, a man whose voice was believed to be the very echo of God's own. His loss left the entire nation feeling adrift, like a ship that had lost its anchor. But for David, the loss was a dagger. It wasn't just a national figure who had died. It was his mentor, his secret champion, the one man who understood the sacred oil that had once marked his own brow. Let's just pause and picture David, shall we? He's no longer the ruddy-cheeked boy from Bethlehem. The years on the run from the jealous King Saul have carved new lines on his face, lines of worry and weariness. His hands, though they can still play the harp with a tenderness that could make angels weep, are calloused and strong, accustomed to the grip of a sword. His eyes, though, they still hold that fire, that poet's soul. And now they are clouded with grief. He sat alone on a rocky outcrop overlooking his makeshift camp. Below, the low murmur of 600 men trying to go about their evening chores was a familiar hum, but tonight it felt distant, muted. He could remember Samuel's visit to his father's house as if it were yesterday. The smell of the sacrificial meal, the stern, searching eyes of the old prophet passing over his tall, handsome brothers, one by one. David had been the last one called, summoned from the fields, smelling of sheep and sunshine. He remembered the shock, the warmth of the oil trickling through his hair, the dizzying, terrifying whisper in his soul that his life was no longer his own. Samuel had been his rock. When King Saul, in his paranoid rages, first turned against him, it was to Samuel's home in Ramah that David had fled. The old prophet had sheltered him, a silent, powerful shield against the king's madness. Samuel had been the living, breathing proof that David wasn't insane, that the promise of a kingdom wasn't a fever dream. And now that proof was gone, buried. The silence he left behind was deafening. His most trusted general, his fierce nephew Joab, approached him cautiously. Joab was a man of action, not words. He understood battle strategy and the loyalty of soldiers, but the deep, quiet sorrow of his commander was a territory he navigated with unease. "David," he said, his voice raspy, "the men are unsettled. Your grief is their grief." David looked up, his gaze far away. "He is gone, Joab, the light of Israel." "He was an old man," Joab said, which was his way of trying to be comforting. "He lived a long and full life." "He was more than a man," David murmured, turning a smooth, cool stone over and over in his palm. "He was our connection. Now I am truly alone with Saul." The threat of King Saul was a constant shadow. Even here, deep in the wilderness of Ziph, they were never entirely safe. Saul's spies could be anywhere. A shepherd on a distant hill, a merchant with a train of camels. Anyone could be reporting their location back to the unstable king. With Samuel gone, David felt a new vulnerability. The prophet, even in his old age, had held a moral authority that even Saul hesitated to cross completely. That buffer was now gone. It was this feeling, this potent cocktail of grief and tactical vulnerability, that led David to a decision. They had to move. "We leave at dawn," David announced, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual command. "Gather the scouts. We head south, to the wilderness of Paran." A ripple of surprise went through his command. Paran, that was far and desolate. The wilderness of Ziph and Maon, where they had been hiding, was rugged, yes, but it was still within the tribal lands of Judah. It was familiar territory. There were friendly clans, hidden springs they knew, caves they had mapped. Paran was different. It was a vast, unforgiving expanse of rock and sand, a true no-man's land stretching down toward the Sinai. It was a place of exile. It was the perfect place to disappear. The decision was a heavy one. Moving wasn't just a matter of 600 fighting men packing their swords and shields. Many of these men had their families with them. Wives, children, elderly parents who had thrown their lot in with David's. It was a moving village, a tribe in exile. Moving meant dismantling the entire fabric of their temporary lives. Tents had to be struck, cooking pots packed, the few precious livestock herded. It was an enormous undertaking, a testament to the absolute loyalty these people had for their leader. They believed in the oil on his brow, even if he himself was beginning to doubt. And so, as the first hint of gray dawn touched the eastern hills, David's camp was a whirlwind of organized chaos. The sounds were a symphony of exodus, the bleating of sheep, the protesting groan of a loaded donkey, the quiet weeping of a child being bundled against the morning chill, the low, encouraging murmurs of husbands and fathers, and the sharp, clear commands of David's lieutenants, Joab, Abishai, and the rest, directing the flow of people and animals like seasoned shepherds guiding a vast flock. David himself moved among them, his personal grief packed away in favor of the needs of his people. He helped an old woman secure a bundle to her donkey, shared a piece of dried bread with a wide-eyed boy, and offered a word of encouragement to a young soldier nervously scanning the horizon for any sign of Saul's men. Their journey south was arduous. The landscape grew progressively starker. The rolling, scrub-covered hills of Judah gave way to jagged cliffs and deep, sun-scorched canyons. The air grew drier, the sun more relentless. Paran was a place that stripped you down to your essentials: water, food, and faith. For weeks, this became their new reality. They became creatures of the wilderness, their skin tanned to leather, their senses sharpened to the slightest sign of life: a distant bird, the track of a gazelle, the scent of water on the wind. David's men, despite the hardship, were not idle. They were a formidable fighting force, and they had to be. They became the unofficial guardians of this harsh land. They learned its secrets, its hidden oases, its defensible positions. And they also became a strange sort of desert police force. The wilderness was full of dangers that had nothing to do with King Saul. There were bandits, marauding Amalekites, opportunistic raiders who preyed on the shepherds and traders who dared to cross the wastes. David's men, with their discipline and strength, became a shield for these common folk. They drove off the bandits and created a bubble of safety in the lawless expanse. They asked for nothing in return. It was enough to be useful, to be protectors instead of just fugitives. Their reputation grew. The shepherds who grazed their flocks on the edges of Paran began to speak of the men of David with respect and gratitude. Now, let us leave David and his band of weary exiles for a moment and travel north, just a little way. Let's shift our gaze from the harsh, sunburned landscape of Paran to a place of green pastures and bubbling springs. Our story, you see, is a tale of two households, two worlds about to collide. We find ourselves near the town of Carmel, not the famous Mount Carmel by the sea, but a smaller, wealthier Carmel nestled in the fertile hills of southern Judah. This is a land of abundance. The hills are dotted with ancient olive trees, their silvery leaves shimmering in the gentle breeze. The valleys are lush with grass, perfect for grazing. And it is here that we meet our second main character. His name was Nabal, and he was, to put it mildly, a piece of work. The scriptures are often subtle, but not with Nabal. The Bible says his name was Nabal, and it doesn't take a Hebrew scholar to know what that means. Fool. It's a wonder his parents named him that, but perhaps he grew into it with such spectacular enthusiasm that it simply stuck. He was a man from the nearby town of Maon, but his business, his vast, sprawling enterprise, was here in Carmel. And what a business it was. The man was fabulously wealthy. We're told he owned 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. Now, that might just sound like a big number, but let's try to imagine the scale of it. 4,000 animals. Imagine the sheer space they would take up, a sea of bleeding, woolly bodies flowing over the hills. Imagine the army of shepherds and servants required to manage them, to guard them from predators, to lead them to fresh pasture and water. Nabal was not a farmer, he was a CEO. He was the lord of a massive agricultural corporation, a baron of wool and meat. His wealth wasn't just in the animals themselves, but in the trade, they generated, the sacks of wool sold in Hebron, the salted meat traded with caravans heading to Egypt, the milk and cheese that fed his enormous household. Nabal lived in a large, well-appointed house, probably made of sturdy, cut stone. It would have had a central courtyard with a fountain, rooms filled with fine pottery and woven hangings, and storehouses overflowing with grain, wine, and oil. He was a man insulated by his riches, buffered from the harsh realities of the world by layers of servants and sycophants. And his personality. The scriptures describe him as surly and mean in his dealings. He was a man whose soul had shriveled even as his bank account had swelled. He was harsh with his servants, dismissive of his neighbors, and suspicious of strangers. His default setting was a sneer. He saw kindness as weakness and generosity as a foolish waste of resources. He was, by all accounts, a loud, red-faced, blustering man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice, especially when he was using it to belittle someone. He was a Calebite, meaning he was descended from the great hero Caleb, who had stood with Joshua and had faith in God's promises. The irony was staggering. Nabal was a blot on his noble lineage, a shriveled grape on a heroic vine. At this particular moment, the Nabal estate was buzzing with a special kind of energy. It was the time for sheep shearing. For us today, shearing sheep sounds like a chore, but in Nabal's time and place, it was a major festival. It was the harvest time for a shepherd. It meant the year's profits were about to be realized. It was a time of immense relief and celebration. All the hard work of the past year, protecting the flock from lions and bears, finding pasture during the dry season, tending to sick lambs, had paid off. The shearing was a time to feast, to drink, to be generous. It was customary for the owner of the flock to throw a huge party for his shearers, his servants, his neighbors, and even for any passing strangers. It was a time to share the blessing of abundance. So, Nabal's estate in Carmel was a hive of activity. In the vast pens, hundreds of sheep were being herded, their panicked bleats filling the air. The shearers, strong men with sharp blades, were working quickly, their bodies slick with sweat, expertly peeling the thick, greasy fleece from the animals. In the courtyards of the main house, servants were rushing about. Huge ovens were being fired up to bake mountains of bread. Great clay jars of wine were being brought up from the cellars. Lambs and goats were being slaughtered for the feast, the smell of roasting meat beginning to mingle with the dust and the wool. It was a scene of chaotic, noisy, prosperous celebration, and at the center of it all, like a foul-tempered king on a slightly too small throne, was Nabal. He wasn't shearing, of course. That was work for lesser men. He was observing, shouting orders, complaining that the shearers were too slow, that the servants were wasting wine, that a particular sheep looked smaller than it should. He was counting every fleece, his mind tallying up his profits, his face flushed with self-importance and cheap wine. But there is another person in this household, and she is the heart of our story. In this house of noise and greed, there was a center of quiet grace. Her name was Abigail. The Bible tells us two things about her right away. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman. And you have to wonder, don't you? How on earth did a woman like this end up married to a man like Nabal? The text doesn't say, but we can guess. In that culture, marriages were often arranged. Perhaps her father saw a chance to align his family with Nabal's immense wealth. Perhaps it was a business deal, a merger of assets where her grace and beauty were considered a fair trade for his land and flocks. Whatever the reason, here she was, the lady of a great house, married to a fool. Let's picture Abigail. Her beauty wasn't just in the symmetry of her face or the elegance of her posture, though she had both. It was an inner beauty that radiated outward. It was in the kindness of her eyes, the gentle set of her mouth, the quiet competence with which she moved through her world. While her husband was creating chaos, she was the one creating order. We can imagine her overseeing the preparations for the feast, not by shouting, but with quiet, clear instructions. She'd ensure the bread was baked just right, that the guest rooms were clean, that the younger servants weren't being bullied by the older ones. She moved through the clamor of her husband's world with a preternatural calm, a small island of sanity in a sea of foolishness. Her intelligence was her defining feature. This wasn't just about being clever. It was a deep wisdom, an understanding of people and situations. She saw the world clearly. She knew her husband for exactly what he was. There was no illusion, no pretense. She lived with the daily reality of his temper, his greed, his utter lack of empathy. It must have been an incredibly lonely existence, a partnership of soul and spirit. The ideal of marriage was impossible with a man like Nabal. Her life was one of managing his moods, smoothing over his offenses, and protecting the household from the consequences of his folly. She was the unofficial diplomat of the Nabal estate, constantly performing damage control. On this day of the sheep shearing, we can imagine she felt a familiar sense of dread mixed with duty. She knew the feast would bring out the worst in her husband. The more he drank, the louder and more offensive he would become. She would have to be vigilant, ready to diffuse arguments, to soothe hurt feelings, to be the gracious hostess who made everyone feel welcome, even as the host himself was making them feel utterly worthless. She might have taken a moment for herself, perhaps in a quiet corner of the garden, away from the noise. She might have looked out over the green hills of Carmel, the source of all her husband's wealth, and felt the deep disconnect between the beauty of the land and the ugliness of its master. She understood the principle of the harvest festival, the call to generosity and gratitude. And she knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in her stomach, that her husband understood only profit and loss. So now our stage is set. The two worlds are established, spinning in their own orbits, completely unaware of each other. In the south, in the barren wilderness of Paran, is David. He is a man of destiny, anointed by God, but currently living in hardship. He is grieving, vulnerable, yet leading his people with a sense of responsibility. He and his men are acting as protectors, bringing a measure of peace to a lawless land, their good deeds echoing quietly among the shepherds and traders. They are hungry, they are weary, but they are bound together by loyalty and a shared purpose. And to the north, in the lush hills of Carmel, is Nabal. He is a man of immense wealth, but impoverished in spirit. He is arrogant, mean, and foolish. His world is a bubble of opulence, and he is celebrating his good fortune, not with gratitude, but with boorish self-congratulation. And beside him, trapped in this gilded cage, is Abigail, wise, discerning, and beautiful, a pearl of great price hidden in a swine's trough. These two worlds are on a collision course. A simple request is about to be made. A request for bread and water from a wandering warrior to a wealthy landowner. It's a request that will test the character of everyone involved. It will set in motion a chain of events that will bring a fool to his ruin, a warrior to the brink of a terrible sin, and a wise woman to her ultimate destiny. The sun beats down on the rocks of Paran. The scent of roasting meat wafts through the air in Carmel, and the threads of fate are beginning to draw tight. Our story resumes in the stark, sun-bleached wilderness of Paran. The initial, sharpest pangs of David's grief for the prophet Samuel have softened into a constant, dull ache, a new piece of the rugged landscape of his heart. Life for his 600 followers has found its own rhythm, dictated by the rising sun, the search for water, and the ever-present need for vigilance. They have become masters of this desolate domain, their camp a small, disciplined island of humanity in a vast, rocky sea. Their presence, as we've discussed, has become a blessing to others. The shepherds who once grazed their flocks in fear of bandits now do so in peace, knowing that David's men are a watchful, protective presence, a wall of unseen guardians. It was one of these shepherds who brought the news. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, who had sought refuge near David's camp one night, sharing his small fire and even smaller meal with two of David's sentries. In return, they had shared their water and their protection. In the course of their quiet conversation under the brilliant desert stars, the shepherd mentioned the goings-on back in the civilized world he'd left behind. "It is a grand time in Carmel," he said, his eyes crinkling at the memory. "Nabal has begun his sheep shearing. The feasting will last for days. I have never seen so much food in one place. The smell of roasting lamb carries for miles on the wind." When this tidbit of information made its way to David, a thoughtful, strategic look came into his eyes. It was more than just a passing piece of gossip. It was an opportunity. His people were stretched thin. The wilderness was a hard provider. They subsisted on what they could hunt a gazelle here, a wild bird there, and what little grain they could trade for. Their provisions were critically low. The children were looking gaunt, and the morale of his men, while strong in spirit, was being eroded by the constant gnawing in their bellies. He called his inner circle together, the formidable trio of Joab, Abishai, and his wisest counselor, Ahithophel. They gathered in David's tent, the flaps tied back to let in the breeze, which did little to stir the hot, stagnant air. "I have heard that Nabal of Carmel is holding his shearing feast," David began, his voice calm and measured. He looked at the faces of his most trusted men. "His shepherds have grazed their flocks in this region for months. You all know the reports from our patrols. Have any of his men or animals come to harm on our watch?" Joab, ever the pragmatist, shook his head. "None. Our men have treated them as brothers. We have been, as their own servants have said, a wall around them by day and by night. We have driven off 2 separate bands of Amalekite raiders who saw Nabal's flocks as an easy prize. He owes his entire year's profit to our presence." "Exactly," David said, nodding. "We have provided a service, a valuable one. We have been good neighbors, even from a distance. The custom of the shearing feast is one of generosity. It is a time when a man of means shares his bounty. I believe it is right and reasonable that we ask for a share." Abishai, Joab's brother, and always the most hot-headed of the group, slammed a fist into his palm. "Ask. We should demand. The man is a well-known miser, David. He hoards his wealth while better men starve. We should just go and take what we need." David held up a hand, silencing him. "No, Abishai. That is how bandits behave. That is how Saul behaves. We are not them. We will ask. We will approach him with honor and respect, as one son of Judah to another. We are not beggars, but we are also not thieves. We are his protectors, and we will request a portion of the provisions he is enjoying because of our protection. It is a matter of justice." He paused, his gaze sweeping over them. "Nabal is a wealthy man. His storehouses are overflowing. To share a small fraction with us, with 600 of his countrymen and their families, is a small thing for him. It is life and death for us. I cannot believe he would refuse such a reasonable request, especially at a time of celebration." David's logic was sound. His plan was honorable. It was based on the principles of mutual respect and ancient custom. He was so certain of the rightness of his cause that he couldn't conceive of its failure. He had faced down lions and giants and the armies of the Philistines. Surely he could handle a negotiation with a wealthy sheep rancher. "I will send a delegation," David declared. 10 young men, a number that shows respect. They will not go armed for battle, but as emissaries of peace. They will carry our greetings and our goodwill. They will explain the situation plainly and humbly. And I am sure they will return with Nabal's blessing and provisions for our people." And so, 10 young men were chosen. They were eager and honored by the task. Their leader was a man named Abigail, known for his steady nerve and clear head. He was in his early 20s, but he had the quiet maturity of an older man, a quality forged in the crucible of life on the run with David. His second in command, a friend named Zadok, was of a different temperament, quicker to laugh, but also quicker to anger, fiercely loyal and protective of David's honor. They prepared for their journey with a sense of hopeful anticipation. They washed the desert dust from their faces and put on the best tunics they owned, though best was a relative term. They were still frayed and travel-stained, but they made the effort. They weren't just representing themselves, they were representing David. As they checked their water skins and packed a few dried figs for the journey, a buzz of optimism spread through the camp. The children's eyes were a little brighter. The women whispered prayers for the messenger's success. The thought of fresh bread, of roasted meat, and jugs of wine was a powerful tonic. The journey from the heart of the Paran wilderness to the estate of Nabal in Carmel was like walking from one world into another. For the first day, they trudged through the familiar, harsh beauty of their adopted home. The sun beat down on a landscape of rust-colored rock and thorny acacia trees. The silence was vast, broken only by the crunch of their sandals on the gravel and the occasional cry of a hawk circling in the thermal currents high above. They walked with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to hardship, conserving their energy and their water, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Then, gradually, the world began to change. The red rock began to give way to limestone hills. They started to see patches of stubborn green grass, then small, hardy shrubs. The air, which had been scorching and dry, began to carry a hint of moisture, a faint, sweet smell of vegetation. By the morning of the second day, they had entered the hill country of Judah. The transformation was complete. They were walking through rolling green hills, a landscape that seemed impossibly lush to their desert-acclimatized eyes. Ancient olive groves clung to the slopes, and in the valleys, they saw them, the flocks. First, a few dozen sheep, then 100, then what seemed like thousands. They covered the hillsides like patches of moving snow. Healthy, well-fed, fat animals. Shepherds watched over them, leaning on their staffs, their faces peaceful. These were Nabal's flocks. Eliel and his men saw the shepherds, and the shepherds saw them. There were nods of recognition. Some of these very shepherds had been protected by David's patrols. The sight of this immense, peaceful prosperity buoyed the spirits of the 10 messengers. "Look at that, Zadok," Eliel said, gesturing to a vast flock that drank from a clear, gurgling stream. "The man truly is as wealthy as they say. Surely a man so blessed by God will have a generous heart." Zadok grunted, his eyes fixed on the fat-tailed sheep. "I'm not thinking about his heart. I'm thinking about my stomach. One of those roasting over a fire would be a blessing from God indeed." As they drew closer to Carmel, the signs of the festival became unmistakable. The air grew thick with the smells of civilization, wood smoke, baking bread, and the rich, savory aroma of roasting meat. The sounds changed, too. The silence of the desert was replaced by a growing hum of human activity, the distant shouts of men, the bleating of penned sheep, the faint strains of music. Their pace quickened. The promised land was in sight. They arrived at Nabal's estate in the late afternoon, when the celebration was in full swing. The scene that greeted them was one of overwhelming, chaotic abundance. The main courtyard was crowded with people. Shearers, their work for the day done, sat in boisterous groups, their faces flushed with wine, their voices loud. Servants, both male and female, rushed back and forth, carrying huge platters of steaming meat and massive loaves of flatbread. The ground was littered with discarded bones and spilled wine. The air was thick and heavy, a potent mix of sweat, wool, smoke, and alcohol. Abigail and his 9 companions stood at the edge of the courtyard for a moment, taking it all in. In their simple, dusty clothes, they felt like ghosts from another world. They were men of the wilderness, accustomed to silence, discipline, and scarcity. This scene of loud, messy, gluttonous excess was jarring. A flicker of unease went through Abigail. This didn't feel like a holy festival of gratitude. It felt like a brawl. They needed to find Nabal. They asked a passing servant, a young boy whose arms were straining under the weight of a heavy wineskin. The boy, without stopping, jerked his head toward a raised platform at the far end of the courtyard. There, he mumbled, the master. And there he was, Nabal. He was seated on a large, carved wooden chair like a makeshift throne, a veritable mountain of a man. His face was a deep, mottled red, and his tunic was stained with grease and wine. He was surrounded by a small group of what looked like business associates or cronies, men with similarly florid faces and loud voices. He held a large pottery goblet of wine in one meaty fist, and he was in the middle of a story, his voice booming over the general din. He wasn't just drinking, he was performing. He was the star of his own magnificent show. Abigail took a deep breath. He gathered his 9 companions with a look. Remember David's words, he said softly. Respect, humility. Let me do the talking. They moved through the crowd, a small, sober procession parting the sea of drunken revelers. As they approached the platform, Nabal's laughter cut off. He squinted at them, his eyes struggling to focus on these 10 dusty strangers who had interrupted his performance. What is it? He bellowed, his voice thick and slurred. Who are you? More beggars looking for a handout. Abigail stepped forward and bowed low, a gesture of profound respect. His companions did the same. He kept his voice steady and clear, pitching it to be heard over the noise, but without shouting. He began with the precise words of greeting David had instructed him to use. Long life to you, my lord, Abigail began, his tone formal and courteous. Good health to you and to your household, and good health to all that is yours. It was a beautiful, traditional blessing. Nabal just stared at him, a look of bored impatience on his face. He made a gesture with his goblet that might have been acknowledgement, or might have been him trying to wave away a fly. Abigail continued, pressing on into the heart of their message. My lord, we have come because we hear that it is your sheep shearing time, a time of joy and celebration. We are the men of David, son of Jesse. At the mention of David's name, a flicker of something recognition, contempt crossed Nabal's face. He leaned forward slightly, his piggy eyes narrowing. Abigail pressed his advantage, laying out their case with simple, inarguable facts. When your shepherds were with us in the wilderness, we did not mistreat them. We protected them. The whole time they were near our camp in Carmel, not a single one of their animals was missing. You can ask your own young men. They will tell you it is true. As Abigail spoke, some of the shepherds and servants on the edges of the crowd, who had been listening with nervous curiosity, subtly nodded their heads. They knew it was true. They had seen David's men, had benefited from their protection, but they dared not speak. All eyes were on Nabal, and his face was darkening. The festive red was deepening into an angry purple. Abigail reached the conclusion of his appeal, his voice filled with a humble sincerity. Therefore, my lord, we ask you to be favorable toward my young men, since we have come at this festive time. We do not demand a specific tribute. We simply ask that you please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them in your great abundance. He used the term your son David deliberately. It was a term of deep respect, acknowledging Nabal as an elder and a man of great standing, positioning David as a younger man showing deference. The request was polite. The reasoning was sound. The tone was humble. By any standard of decency, custom, or common sense, it should have been met with, at the very least, a civil response. Abigail and the 9 young men stood with their heads still bowed, waiting. The courtyard had grown quieter. The nearby conversations had died down as people strained to hear the exchange. A heavy, tense silence hung in the air, thick with the smell of wine. Nabal looked down at the 10 men before him. He looked at their dusty clothes and their hopeful, waiting posture. A slow, ugly smirk spread across his thick lips. He took a long, noisy gulp from his goblet, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and then he leaned back in his chair and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a cruel, braying laugh, full of contempt. Then he spoke, and his words fell like stones, like poison darts. "Who?" he roared, his voice dripping with scorn. "Who is this David?" The question hung in the air, a deliberate, calculated insult. Of course he knew who David was. The whole country knew. The man who killed Goliath, the hero of 100 songs sung by the women of Israel. To pretend not to know him was to declare him a nobody. Nabal wasn't finished. He leaned forward again, his voice rising in a crescendo of drunken rage. "And who is this son of Jesse?" This was even worse. Son of Jesse. It was a tag of dismissal, reducing David to his humble origins, stripping him of all his accomplishments. He wasn't David the warrior, David the leader, David the anointed of God. He was just some boy from a backwater village, the son of a provincial sheep farmer. Nabal was on his feet now, swaying slightly, his face contorted in a mask of indignation. He pointed a fat, trembling finger at Abigail. "I know who he is," he shouted, his spittle flying. "These days, there are many servants breaking away from their masters. He is a runaway, a traitor, a vagabond leading a gang of outlaws. He was parroting the official propaganda of King Saul's court, branding David and his loyal followers as rebels and criminals. To Nabal, a man whose entire world was built on property and social hierarchy, David represented chaos, an upending of the proper order of things. He was a threat. He then turned his tirade to the request itself, his voice filled with a furious, selfish possessiveness. "And you want me to do what?" he bellowed, gesturing wildly at the platters of food and jugs of wine. "Why should I take my bread and my water and the meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers?" He spat the word "my" each time, as if it were a weapon, and give it to a bunch of men who come from who knows where. He glared at the 10 messengers, his eyes full of hatred. He had dismissed their identity, insulted their leader, and mocked their request. He had violated every code of hospitality and decency. In his drunken, arrogant mind, he had put these upstarts in their place. He had shown everyone what a strong, important man he was, a man who bowed to no one. The 10 young men were frozen in shock and humiliation. The blood had drained from Eliel's face. Zadok's hands were clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides, and it took every ounce of his discipline not to draw the short sword at his belt. The insult was not just to them. It was a profound, public, and venomous attack on David himself, their beloved commander. Eliel, his voice barely a whisper, said, "My lord, get out." Nabal screamed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Get out of my sight before I have my servants throw you out. Go back to your son of Jesse and tell him Nabal bows to no runaway slave." There was nothing more to say. The rejection was absolute. The insult was total. With as much dignity as they could muster, Eliel turned and led his men away. They walked back through the courtyard, the eyes of everyone on them. Some looked with pity, some with fear, and Nabal's cronies with mocking laughter. The festive sounds of the party seemed to curdle in the air behind them. They left the estate and began the long walk back toward the wilderness of Paran. The journey out had been one of hope. The journey back was a silent march of dread. The lush, green hills that had seemed so beautiful and promising just hours before now seemed to mock them. The abundance of the land felt like a personal rebuke. For the first hour, no one spoke. They just walked, the shame and anger a burning coal in each of their hearts. Finally, Zadok could bear the silence no longer. "The man is a dog," he spat, his voice low and vicious. "A fat, drunken, arrogant dog. David will kill him. He will kill them all." "Quiet, Zadok," Eliel said, his own voice heavy. "Our duty now is not to guess what David will do. Our duty is to report what was said, exactly as it was said." "And you will tell him?" Zadok asked. "You will tell him Nabal called him a runaway slave?" "I will tell him every word," Eliel said grimly. "David must know the truth of this man. He must know the full depth of the insult." And so they walked on, the conversation dying out again, replaced by the heavy tramp of their own feet. Each step brought them closer to their camp, closer to David, closer to the moment of reckoning. They were no longer just messengers returning with bad news. They felt like men carrying a lit torch back to a storehouse of gunpowder. They knew David. They knew his sense of honor, his love for his men, and his righteous temper. and they knew that the words they carried, the words of the fool Nabal, were about to unleash a storm. They arrived back at the camp late the next day, exhausted and heartsick. The hopeful energy that had filled the air when they left was gone, replaced by anxious waiting. The people saw the look on their faces, saw their empty hands, and knew immediately that they had failed. They found David waiting for them outside his tent. He stood alone, watching their approach, his face unreadable. He didn't need to ask if they had been successful. The answer was written in the weary slump of their shoulders. Abigail walked up to his commander and stopped. He didn't bow this time. He just stood and met David's gaze. "We delivered your message, my lord," he said, his voice raw with fatigue and suppressed emotion. "Word for word." And David's voice was quiet, dangerously quiet. Abigail took a deep breath. He reported the entire encounter, his memory seared with the details. He recounted Nabal's drunken state, his mocking laughter, and then the insults themselves, each one landing like a physical blow in the still desert air. He asked, "Who is this David? Who is the son of Jesse? He called us. He called you runaway servants." He said, "Why should I take my bread and my meat and give it to men from who knows where? He refused us everything and sent us away with contempt." Abigail finished, and a profound silence fell. It was the silence before a lightning strike. The 10 messengers stood before their leader, their mission complete, their terrible news delivered. They had brought the spark back to the powder keg, and now all they could do was wait for the explosion. The silence that followed Abigail's report was not empty. It was dense, heavy, and humming with a terrible energy, like the air before a desert thunderstorm. David stood motionless before his 10 messengers, but a storm was gathering behind his eyes. The man who grieved for Samuel, the poet who composed psalms, the careful leader who weighed every decision, that man was gone. In his place stood the warrior, the chieftain whose honor had been publicly shredded, whose generosity of spirit had been repaid with venomous contempt. His face, tanned and weathered by years in the wilderness, seemed to harden, the lines around his jaw tightening as if chiseled from the very rock beneath his feet. His gaze, usually warm and thoughtful, became flinty and cold. He had offered peace, and Nabal had thrown it back in his face. He had offered the hand of a brother, and Nabal had spit on it, calling him a slave. In the brutal calculus of the ancient world, an insult of this magnitude, left unanswered, was an admission of weakness. And weakness, for a fugitive leader with a king hunting him, was a death sentence. When David finally broke the silence, his voice was not a shout. It was far more frightening than that. It was a low, controlled command, as sharp and cold as the edge of a newly honed blade. "Every man," he said, his eyes sweeping over the assembled men, "strap on your sword." The words sliced through the camp's apprehension and ignited it into a fire of pure, unified rage. For weeks, these men had endured hunger, thirst, and the gnawing uncertainty of their exile. They had followed David with unwavering loyalty. They had taken pride in their role as guardians of the wilderness, protectors of the common folk. Nabal's insult was not just aimed at David, it was aimed at every single one of them. He had called them a gang of runaway slaves. He had mocked their leader, who they loved with a devotion that bordered on worship. Their simmering resentment at their own hardship found a perfect target in the arrogant, wealthy fool in Carmel. A guttural roar of approval went up from the men. The camp, which moments before had been quiet with anxious waiting, exploded into purposeful, deadly activity. The sound was not one of chaos, but of a terrible, disciplined fury being unleashed. It was the sound of 600 swords being drawn from leather scabbards, a chilling, metallic hiss that spoke of lethal intent. It was the clatter of bronze helmets being donned, the creak of leather armor being buckled, the terse, grim commands of squad leaders organizing their units. Zadok, the young messenger whose anger had been simmering since he'd first laid eyes on Nabal, felt a surge of savage vindication. He looked at Abigail, his own face dark with a grim satisfaction. "I told you," he said, his voice low and tight as he checked the grip of his sword. "I told you this would be the only answer." Abigail simply nodded, his face pale. He had hoped for provisions, not bloodshed, but he understood the grim necessity of this moment. The insult could not stand. David turned without another word and strode to his own tent. He moved with a stiff, furious grace. He threw aside the tent flap and took up his own sword belt. As he buckled the heavy leather around his waist, the familiar weight of the weapon was both a comfort and a catalyst. This was the part of his life he understood most viscerally. The complexities of politics, the grief of loss, they were mists and shadows. The cold, hard reality of steel was simple. It delivered verdicts. His nephew Abishai entered the tent, his eyes alight with a fierce battle lust. "All the men are ready, David. They are eager to teach this dog a lesson in respect." David didn't look at him. He was staring at nothing, his mind's eye fixed on the smug, drunken face of Nabal as described by his messengers. He replayed the insults, each one a fresh application of salt to a gaping wound. Who is this David, son of Jesse? Runaway servants. It was a complete negation of his life, his calling, his anointing by Samuel. It was as if Nabal had declared that God's choice was meaningless, and the ingratitude, that was the deepest cut of all. "It's been useless," David muttered to himself, the words that would later form part of his lament. "All my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing. It has been utterly in vain. I have protected him, and he has paid me back evil for good." He felt the rage coiling in his gut, a righteous, holy fury. This was not just a personal slight. This was an offense against the very principle of justice. Nabal was a cancer of selfishness and arrogance in the heart of Judah, and David, as the Lord's anointed, felt a sudden, terrifying clarity. It was his duty to cut it out. He turned to Abishai, and his voice was low, laced with the chilling finality of an oath sworn before God. "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, he vowed. If by tomorrow morning I leave alive a single male of all who belong to Nabal. The oath was absolute. It was not just Nabal he would destroy. It was his sons, his servants, his shepherds, every male in his household, from the highest to the lowest. It was a vow of total annihilation, a terrifyingly disproportionate response born of a deeply wounded honor and a white-hot rage. The vow was a cage, and David had just locked himself inside it. To break it now would be to call a curse from God upon himself. He stepped out of the tent into the harsh afternoon light. The sight that greeted him was a testament to his power as a leader. 600 armed men stood in disciplined ranks, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on him, waiting for the command. They were a lethal weapon, and he was about to aim it straight at the heart of Carmel. Joab, he called, and his other nephew, the shrewd general, came forward. 200 men will remain here. Guard the camp. Guard the families. The rest of you, 400 of you, you come with me. It was a sound, tactical decision, a flicker of the commander's mind, operating even within the inferno of his anger. He would not leave their home base unprotected, but the force he was taking was overwhelming. 400 veteran warriors, hardened by years of guerrilla warfare, against the soft, unsuspecting household of a civilian landowner. It was not to be a battle, it was to be a slaughter. The column formed up quickly and silently. They moved out of the camp, not with shouts or war cries, but with a grim, tramping purpose that was far more terrifying. They were a river of bronze and steel, flowing out of the desolate wilderness and heading north toward the green hills of Carmel. The sun glinted off the points of their spears, and the dust rose in a cloud behind them, a signal of the destruction to come. They were the personification of vengeance, a 400-man instrument of David's wrath, marching to fulfill his terrible vow. The clock had started ticking. Let us now leave that grim procession and fly north, back to the source of all this turmoil. Let us return to the estate of Nabal. The great sheep shearing feast is beginning to wind down, degenerating from a boisterous celebration into a scene of sloppy, drunken excess. The sun is sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the courtyard, which is now a disaster zone of spilled wine, gnawed bones, and snoring bodies. Many of the shearers and servants have drunk themselves into a stupor, passed out in whatever patch of shade they could find. Nabal himself is the king of this drunken mess. He has finally succumbed to the heroic quantities of wine he has consumed. He sits slumped in his great chair, his head lolling on his chest, a trickle of drool escaping from the corner of his open mouth, emitting loud, guttural snores. He is oblivious, safe in his cocoon of arrogance and alcohol, dreaming, no doubt, of his own magnificence. He has forgotten all about the 10 dusty messengers. In his mind, he dealt with them, sent them packing, and reaffirmed his own supreme importance. He has no idea that death is at this very moment marching toward him from the south. But not everyone in the household is oblivious. There are those who are not drunk, whose eyes are wide open, and whose hearts are filled with a cold, creeping dread. One of these is a servant. The scriptures do not give him a name, but let us call him Eliam, for a good man deserves a name. Eliam is not just a common field hand. He is one of Nabal's senior managers, perhaps the chief overseer of the shepherds. He is a man of sense and responsibility, weathered and wise in the ways of the land, the flocks, and most importantly, the men. He has spent months out in the pastures with his teams, and he was one of the primary beneficiaries of the protection offered by David's men. He himself had seen them, a distant but reassuring presence, a wall, as he would later say. He had been in the courtyard when Abigail and David's other messengers had arrived. He had watched the entire exchange from a distance, his heart sinking with every word that fell from his master's drunken lips. He had heard the polite, reasonable request. He had heard the vicious, insulting rejection. While Nabal's cronies had laughed, Eliam had felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew David, not personally, but by reputation, a reputation forged in battle and blood. He knew that men like David do not absorb such insults lightly. Nabal had not just refused a request for food, he had thrown a lit torch into a powder magazine. While his master snored, Eliam paced in a hidden corner of the estate, his mind racing. What was to be done? Disaster was coming. He could feel it in his bones, as surely as he could feel the evening breeze beginning to stir. He could run. He could pack a small bag, slip away into the hills, and save his own skin. It was the sensible thing to do. He owed Nabal no loyalty. The man was a cruel and foolish master. But Eliam was not just loyal to Nabal. He was loyal to the household, to the other servants, his friends, to the women and children, to the land itself, which he had tended his whole life, to his mistress, the Lady Abigail, who had always treated him and the other servants with a kindness and respect that was the complete opposite of her husband's cruelty. To flee would be to abandon them all to the firestorm that he knew was coming. He had to warn someone. But who? The answer was painfully obvious. It could not be Nabal. He looked over at the snoring lump in the chair. To wake him would be to invite a beating. To try and reason with him, to tell him he had made a catastrophic mistake, would be impossible. The man's pride was a fortress that no logic could breach. As Eliam would later put it, he was a son of Belial, a wicked, worthless man, so consumed by his own arrogance that no one could even talk to him. There was only one person who could possibly avert the coming doom. There was only one person in this entire household who possessed the intelligence, the courage, and the grace to stand in the path of a hurricane. His decision made, Eliam moved with a new urgency. He hurried through the disordered courtyards, stepping over drunken servants and piles of refuse. He entered the main house, which was quieter. He found the Lady Abigail in a large pantry, calmly directing a few of the more sober maids in sorting and storing the leftover food from the feast. She was, as always, creating order out of the chaos her husband had caused. Her face was serene, but her eyes were weary. "My lady," Eliam said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. She turned, and seeing the look of sheer terror on his face, she gave him her full, immediate attention. "Eliam, what is it? You look as if you've seen a ghost." "Worse, my lady," he breathed, stepping closer so no one else could hear. "A future one, all of our ghosts, if we do not act." He poured out the story in a desperate, frantic torrent of words. He told her everything he had witnessed. "My lady, David sent messengers from the wilderness just a few hours ago. They came in peace to give our master his greetings and to ask for provisions." He made sure to emphasize the peacefulness of their approach. But the master, he hurled insults at them. Vile insults. He treated them like dirt under his feet. Abigail's face, already pale, lost another shade of color. She knew her husband's mouth, but this was a new level of folly. Attacking the most powerful warlord in all of Judah was not just rude, it was suicidal. Eliam saw the understanding in her eyes and pressed on, giving his own personal testimony to counter his master's foolishness. "But these men, my lady, David's men, they were very good to us. I was there in the fields with the flocks. They never mistreated us. They never took so much as a single lamb. We were out there for months, and nothing of ours ever went missing." His voice grew more passionate as he relived the memory of that protection. "My lady, you must understand. They were more than just passive presences. They were our guardians. There was a night when a band of Amalekites came over the eastern ridge, thinking we were easy prey. Before we could even sound an alarm, David's men swept down from the rocks and drove them off. We would have lost half the flock, and some of us might have lost our lives. Night and day, my lady, for the entire season, they were a wall around us. The metaphor was powerful. A wall, a living, breathing wall of disciplined warriors protecting Nabal's wealth, the very wealth he was now so jealously hoarding. Eliam took a shaky breath and came to the terrifying climax of his warning. "So now, my lady, you must think it over. You must see what you can do. Because I swear to you, disaster is hanging over our master and this entire household. David is not a man who will suffer such an insult. He is coming, and he will be coming for blood." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial and desperate whisper, justifying why he had broken protocol and come to her instead of his master. "I cannot speak to the master," he said, his eyes pleading with her to understand. "You know how he is. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. He will not listen. He will not see reason. You, my lady, you are our only hope." He finished, breathless, his duty done. He had laid the terrifying truth at her feet. He had passed the torch of responsibility into her hands. The fate of every man, woman, and child on the estate now rested on her shoulders. Abigail stood perfectly still for a long moment, the sounds of the maids working behind her fading into a distant hum. The information washed over her, and her brilliant mind processed it with lightning speed. The servant's report was not a surprise, not really. It was the culmination of everything she knew about her husband. His foolishness, his greed, his arrogance. It had all been leading to a moment like this. She had lived in dread of such a day, and now it was here. She could see the chain of events with horrifying clarity. David's reasonable request, Nabal's drunken, insulting refusal, David's warrior pride wounded beyond repair, a force of angry, hungry men marching to exact their revenge. She could practically hear the tramp of their sandals on the road from the south. Panic was a luxury she could not afford. Despair was a useless indulgence. Her entire life, living with Nabal, had been a training exercise in crisis management, and this was the ultimate crisis. While the man who was supposed to be the protector of the household snored in a drunken stupor, she, the woman, would have to become the savior. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a flash of steel, a look of profound, focused determination. The servant had asked her to think it over and see what you can do. Her mind was already doing it. It was calculating, planning, organizing. A desperate, audacious plan began to form in her mind, a plan that involved speed, resources, and an incredible amount of courage. She would not stand by and watch her household be slaughtered because of the folly of one man. She would act. She would meet the storm head on. There was no panic in Abigail's eyes, only a profound and unnerving clarity. The news that Eliam the servant had delivered was not a spark that ignited fear, but a bellows that fanned the embers of her quiet strength into a roaring flame of purpose. For years, she had navigated the treacherous waters of her husband's foolishness, acting as a silent dam against the flood of his temper and greed. Now the dam had broken. The flood was coming, and she resolved not to be swept away by it, but to stand in its path and turn its course. "Say no more," she commanded Eliam, her voice low and steady, cutting through his panicked breathing. "You have done well to warn me. Now you must help me. Gather every loyal servant you can find, the sober ones. We have no time for the drunks. Meet me at the main storehouses. Go, quickly." Abigail herself did not walk, she flew. She moved through the house with the speed and efficiency of a field marshal preparing for a desperate battle. She was no longer just the lady of the estate. She was its commander-in-chief, its only hope for survival. Her mind, a brilliant and organized instrument, was already issuing a flurry of commands before she even spoke them aloud. She burst into the main pantry and storehouses where a handful of maids were still working. "Leave that," she ordered, her tone so sharp with authority that they froze in place. "We have a new task, a vital one." Eliam and a dozen other trusted servants, their faces pale with worry but resolute, converged on the location. They saw the look on their mistress's face and knew this was a matter of life and death. They were the household's immune system, rushing to the point of infection, and Abigail was their guiding intelligence. "I need provisions," she announced, her eyes scanning the vast shelves of the storehouse. "A gift, a great gift. It must be worthy of a king." She began pointing, her commands crisp and precise. You too to the bakery. I need 200 loaves of bread, not the coarse bread for the shearers, the fine bread. Now, you to the cellars. Bring up 2 of the best skins of wine, the ones my husband saves for the merchants from Tyre, the very best. Eliam, find the head cook. I need 5 sheep. They must already be dressed and cooked. We have no time to slaughter. Take them from the feast if you must. Wrap them for travel. I need grain, roasted grain, 5 seahs of it. She pointed to the large sacks of barley. Measure it out. And fruit, the best we have. 100 clusters of raisins, 200 cakes of pressed figs. The list was specific, generous, and strategic. It was a feast on the move. The 200 loaves of bread were enough for David's 400 men to each have half a loaf, a substantial meal. The 5 dressed sheep were a sign of honor. The wine was of a quality that spoke of respect. The roasted grain, raisins, and fig cakes were high energy, easily transportable rations, the perfect food for soldiers on the march. This was not a random collection of leftovers. It was a carefully curated apology, a peace offering of overwhelming abundance. It was precisely the kind of gift a gracious and wealthy host should have given in the first place. The servants scattered, a whirlwind of purposeful activity. There was no questioning, no hesitation. They trusted Abigail's wisdom implicitly. They knew their lives depended on it. As they worked, loading the bounty into large baskets and sacks, Abigail oversaw the entire operation, her mind 1,000 steps ahead. She called for donkeys to be brought to the rear gate of the estate, away from the main courtyard, where her husband still snored, oblivious. And here, in this moment, Abigail made the most rebellious and courageous decision of her life. The scripture tells us, with beautiful simplicity, she did not tell her husband Nabal. This was more than a simple omission. It was a deliberate act of domestic treason, born of a higher loyalty. She knew Nabal. She knew that if she were to tell him her plan, he would forbid it. His pride would never allow him to apologize, and his greed would never allow him to part with such a vast quantity of provisions. He would rather see his entire household slaughtered, himself included, than admit he was wrong or give away a fraction of his wealth. In that moment, Abigail understood that to be loyal to her foolish husband was to be complicit in the destruction of everyone else. To save her household, she had to betray its master. She chose life. As the servants loaded the provisions onto the backs of the sturdy donkeys, she gave them their final instructions. "Go on ahead of me," she told Eliam. "Take the winding path down through the ravine. Move as fast as you can. I will follow you shortly." This, too, was a brilliant strategy. The massive gift would be the first thing David and his men would encounter. It would be a vanguard of peace, a tangible apology that would arrive before she did. It would, she hoped, begin to cool the fires of his rage and prepare the way for her own appeal. She watched as the train of heavily laden donkeys guided by her most trusted servants, slipped out the back gate and disappeared down the path. Only then did she take a moment for herself. She returned to her chambers, not to dally, but to prepare herself for the confrontation to come. She washed the dust and flour from her face and hands and put on a simple but dignified robe. She was not dressing to impress, but to project a quiet authority. Then she took a deep breath, offered a silent, fervent prayer for the right words, for wisdom, for mercy, and went to meet her destiny. She mounted her own donkey and set off alone, following the path her servants had taken. The path wound its way down from the high ground of Carmel into a deep, secluded mountain ravine. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the hilltops, and the valley was filled with long, cool shadows. It was a lonely, intimidating place. The high rock walls on either side seemed to press in on her, and the only sound was the clip-clop of her donkey's hooves on the stony ground. This solitary journey was her Gethsemane. The adrenaline of the initial preparation had faded, and now the cold reality of her mission set in. What was she truly doing? She was a lone woman, riding out to intercept an army of 400 furious, hungry warriors, led by a notoriously fierce commander who had just sworn to kill every male in her household. What could she possibly say? What could one woman's words do against the sharp points of 400 swords? Fear, cold and sharp, tried to pierce her resolve. But as she rode, she didn't just dwell on her fear. She thought of David. She knew the stories. The shepherd boy who trusted God against a giant. The poet whose heart was tuned to the voice of the Lord. The anointed one, hounded and pursued by a mad king, yet destined for the throne. The man she was riding to meet was not, at his core, a bloodthirsty bandit. He was God's chosen one. But right now, he was a man consumed by a righteous, but dangerous, rage. He was on the verge of committing a terrible sin, a sin that would stain his soul and haunt his future kingdom. Her mission, she realized, was not just to save her own household. It was to save David from himself. This thought gave her a strength beyond her own. She was not just an emissary for her family. She was an emissary for David's own better nature, for his destiny, for his God. Meanwhile, coming up that same winding path from the south was the storm itself. David and his 400 men were moving with grim speed. The rage that had propelled them out of their camp had not cooled. It had hardened into a cold, implacable resolve. David rode near the front, his face a mask of thunder. His earlier vow echoed in his mind, trapping him. He turned to his nephew Abishai, riding beside him, and spoke, his voice full of the bitter justification of the deeply wronged. It's been completely useless. All my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was ever missing. Utterly pointless. I have paid him good, and he has paid me back evil. There is no justice in that. He then repeated his terrible oath, as if to strengthen his own resolve. May God strike me down if I do not fulfill my vow. By morning, not a single one who belongs to him will be left breathing. He was a man on a runaway train, heading for a cliff. He was so locked into his own narrative of righteous vengeance that he was blind to the abyss that lay before him. And so, the two parties moved toward their inevitable collision, hidden from each other by the winding curves of the ravine. Abigail, coming down from the north, a single point of light and hope. David, marching up from the south, a 400-man engine of destruction. Then it happened. Abigail rounded a sharp bend in the path, and suddenly there they were. The ravine was filled with them. An army. A terrifying sea of hard faces, leather armor, and sharpened steel, all lit by the dying rays of the sun. And at their head, a man whose face was so dark with fury, she recognized him instantly as their leader. David. For a heartbeat, her breath caught in her throat, but she did not falter. The scripture says she acted quickly. Without a moment's hesitation, she slid off her donkey and threw herself to the ground, bowing so low that her face was in the dust of the road at David's feet. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The entire column of warriors shuddered to a halt. The men in front stared in stunned silence. A wealthy noblewoman, the lady of a great estate, groveling in the dirt before them like the lowliest of servants. It was not what they expected. They had come expecting to fight arrogant men, not to be met by a prostrate woman. The single, humble, silent action completely shattered the momentum of their rage. David himself reined in his horse, looking down at the woman in the dust before him. His expression, a mixture of surprise and confusion. Before he could even speak, a voice came from the ground, a voice that was clear, steady, and filled with a desperate passion. It was the beginning of one of the most brilliant and persuasive speeches ever recorded. "My lord," Abigail began, her voice slightly muffled by the dust, "upon me, on me alone, be the blame." It was a staggering opening gambit. She didn't argue. She didn't excuse. She didn't defend. She stepped directly into the path of his anger and took the full force of it upon herself. She was validating his rage, agreeing that an offense had been committed, but she was drawing its fire away from the men he had vowed to kill and onto herself, a woman, making it infinitely harder for him to strike. She lifted her head just enough to look at him, her eyes pleading. "Please, let your servant speak to you. Hear the words of your servant." Given little choice, David gave a curt nod. Abigail rose to her knees, still in a posture of profound humility, and continued, her words flowing in a carefully orchestrated stream designed to disarm, persuade, and ultimately save. "My lord, please, pay no attention to that wicked man, my husband Nabal," she said, her voice dripping with a sincerity that was impossible to doubt. "For he is just like his name. His name is Nabal, which means fool, and folly is his constant companion." It was an act of breathtaking rhetorical genius. She was agreeing with David. She was confirming his unspoken assessment of her husband. She was essentially saying, "You are right to be angry. The man who insulted you is a worthless fool. She created an instant alliance with David against her husband's stupidity. This disarming honesty was the last thing he expected. But as for me, your humble servant, she added quickly, I did not see the young men my lord sent. Had I seen them, this offense never would have happened. She subtly separated herself from the crime, framing herself as the voice of reason that was tragically absent at the critical moment. Having apologized and validated his anger, she then pivoted, raising the argument from the dust of the road to the high courts of heaven. And now, my lord, she said, her voice taking on a new prophetic authority, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you yourself live, it is the Lord who has kept you from coming to bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands. Look at what she did. She reframed the entire event. Her interception was not a coincidence. It was a divine appointment. She was presenting herself as God's messenger, sent on a mission to save David from committing a terrible sin. She gave God the credit, appealing directly to David's deepest identity as a man of faith. She was no longer just a wife pleading for her household. She was a prophetess, delivering a word from the Lord. Therefore, she continued, her voice ringing with conviction, let your enemies and all who seek to harm my Lord be as Nabal. It was both a curse and a blessing. She was wishing upon his enemies the same foolish impotence as her husband, while simultaneously elevating David far above such a pathetic creature. Then, gesturing back up the path where her servants waited with the donkeys, she brought the argument back to the practical. And now let this blessing, which your servant has brought to my Lord, be given to the young men who follow you. She called the massive tribute a humble blessing and directed it to his men. This addressed their hunger, honored their service, and won the hearts of the 400 armed witnesses who were listening to every word. Having addressed the past, the insult, and the present, the gift, she then did the most remarkable thing of all. She made David look to his future. Please, forgive the trespass of your servant, she pleaded, her voice softening again. For the Lord will certainly make for my Lord a sure and lasting dynasty, because my Lord fights the battles of the Lord, and no evil or wrongdoing will be found in you all your days. She spoke not of what he was, a hunted fugitive, but of what he would be, the founder of a royal dynasty. She reminded him of his true calling. He wasn't a gang leader avenging a personal slight. He was the chosen champion of God, who fought God's battles, not his own. Her voice took on an almost lyrical, poetic quality. And though a man has risen to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord will be securely bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. The image was beautiful and intimate, David's soul, held safe and precious by God himself. But the lives of your enemies, she contrasted, he will hurl away, as from the hollow of a sling. The sling. She had deliberately chosen the one image that was the bedrock of his entire story. She was reminding him of his greatest triumph, his defining moment of faith. You are David, the slayer of Goliath, she was saying. You are the one who trusts God to defeat your enemies. You are not a common butcher of servants. She then brought her argument to its devastatingly logical conclusion. And when the Lord has done for my Lord, according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and has appointed you ruler over Israel, you will not have this as a grief or a stumbling block to your conscience, that you have shed blood without cause, or that my Lord has avenged himself. This was the checkmate. She painted a picture of his future coronation, the moment of his ultimate triumph, and she showed him the dark stain that this night's massacre would leave upon it. She made him see the ghosts that would haunt his throne, the staggering burden of needless bloodshed that would weigh on his soul for the rest of his life. She was asking him to choose his legacy. She finished her grand appeal with a simple, humble, and poignant request. And when the Lord has dealt well with my Lord, then please remember your servant. She fell silent. Her case was made. She had done all she could do. She remained on her knees in the dusty road, her head bowed, awaiting his verdict. The fate of her household, and indeed, the fate of David's own soul, hung in the balance. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotion. David sat on his horse, looking down at this extraordinary woman. The dark storm of rage in his face had broken. The thunder had passed. He was no longer looking at the wife of his enemy. He was looking at a prophetess, a wise counselor, a savior sent by God. He saw in her face not just beauty, but a profound and holy wisdom. She had not just brought him bread and wine, she had brought him a mirror. And in it, she had shown him the monster he was about to become, and reminded him of the king he was destined to be. A great wave of relief, of gratitude, of sheer awe, washed over him, cleansing the last remnants of his toxic rage. He had been saved from himself. The ravine was still, the air thick with the aftermath of a storm that had miraculously broken without a drop of rain. 400 men, who moments before had been instruments of a killing rage, now stood in silent awe, their swords hanging limp and heavy at their sides. They were watching their leader, David, who sat upon his horse, looking down at the woman kneeling in the dust. The transformation in him was total. The thundercloud of fury had vanished from his face, replaced by a look of profound, humbled clarity. He was gazing at Abigail not as the wife of his enemy, but as a prophetess, a messenger from the very God he served. Slowly, deliberately, David swung his leg over his horse and dismounted. The action itself was a statement. He would not speak down to this woman from on high. He walked toward her, and the jingle of his armor was the only sound in the silent valley. He stopped just before her and extended a hand. He spoke, and his voice was no longer the cold command of a vengeful warlord, but the warm, reverent tone of a man who has just been pulled back from the edge of a precipice. "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel," he said, his voice resonating with genuine gratitude, "who has sent you to me today." He was not just thanking her, he was praising God for her, recognizing her as a divine gift, an answer to a prayer he hadn't even known to pray. Abigail looked up, her face streaked with dust, her eyes wide. David's gaze was filled with an admiration that bordered on reverence. "May you be blessed for your good judgment," he continued, his voice full of wonder. "And blessed are you for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands." As he spoke these words, a shudder seemed to pass through him, the delayed shock of the sin he had so narrowly avoided. In his mind's eye, he saw the scene that almost was, the fires, the screaming, the bodies of servants and shepherds who had done him no wrong. He saw himself standing in the midst of a massacre, his hands stained with innocent blood, his vow fulfilled but his soul destroyed. Abigail's words had not just been wise, they had been a spiritual rescue. She had saved his conscience. She had preserved his future. He looked at her, and his confession tumbled out, a final release of the pride and anger that had so completely possessed him. "Otherwise," he said, and his voice dropped to a near whisper, a testament to the horror he now felt. "As surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, the one who has restrained me from harming you, if you had not come so quickly to meet me, I swear to you, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." He had confessed the full, terrible scope of his intended sin. He was admitting to her that she had not just prevented a small skirmish, she had prevented a wholesale slaughter. He was laying his own darkness bare before her, acknowledging her as the instrument of God's restraint. With the rage now completely gone, replaced by gratitude and relief, David finally turned his attention to the gift. Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him, the scriptures tell us. He gave a signal to his men, and a few of them moved forward to help Abigail's servants unload the donkeys. The sight of the bread, the wine, the roasted sheep, and the sweet figs was met with low murmurs of appreciation from the hungry soldiers. The tension that had gripped the 400-man army finally dissipated, replaced by the simple, happy prospect of a good meal. The peace was sealed not just in words, but in the breaking of bread. David turned back to Abigail, who had now risen to her feet. He gave her a look of profound respect, the look one warrior gives to another who has bested them not with steel, but with superior wisdom. "Go home in peace," he said softly. "Look, I have heard your words, and I have granted your request." The words were a full pardon, a complete acceptance of her appeal. The threat was over. Abigail bowed her head one last time, a deep sense of weary, triumphant relief washing over her. She had met the storm head-on, and through wisdom and courage, she had calmed it. Without another word, she turned, mounted her donkey, and began the journey home. Her ride back up the ravine was surreal. The path that had seemed so menacing on her way down now felt hallowed, a place of sacred encounter. The shadows were no longer threatening, they were peaceful. She thought about the man she had just met, a man capable of both terrifying fury and profound humility, a man who was destined to be king, yet who was willing to be corrected by a woman in the dust. She had saved his honor, and he had honored her wisdom. A strange and powerful connection had been forged in that valley. She arrived back at the estate in the early evening. The rear gate was quiet, but as she drew closer to the main house, the sounds of her husband's ongoing debauchery reached her. She entered the house to a scene of utter chaos. Nabal was still holding his feast, which the Bible says was like the banquet of a king. But it was the banquet of a foolish, drunken king. He was still enthroned in his chair, roaring with laughter at his own jokes, his face flushed, his eyes glazed over. He was, the scripture notes with dry understatement, in high spirits and very drunk. Abigail looked at the scene, her heart filled not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity. While she had been out in a dusty ravine, wrestling with matters of life and death and destiny, he had been here, getting drunk, completely oblivious to the fact that his life had been hanging by the slenderest of threads. She saw him, and her wisdom once again took over. She knew that to tell him anything now, in this state, would be utterly pointless. It would only provoke a fresh round of belligerent, drunken shouting. He was beyond reason. So, with the quiet patience of someone who had long ago mastered the art of managing a fool, she told him nothing at all. She moved silently through the chaos, her very presence a stark contrast to the scene around her. She supervised the cleanup, her calm demeanor a silent rebuke to her husband's foolishness. She waited. The next morning, the sun rose on a different scene. The party was over. The house was quiet, save for the groans of servants nursing their hangovers, and Nabal himself was sober. Well, physically sober. He sat at a large table in the main hall, his head in his hands, nursing a colossal hangover. He was grumpy, irritable, and full of the bitter self-pity that follows a night of grand indulgence. This was the moment Abigail had been waiting for. She approached him, not with anger or recrimination, but with the cool, factual demeanor of someone delivering a report. She sat down opposite him and waited for him to acknowledge her. "What is it, woman?" he grumbled, not even looking up. "Can't you see my head is splitting apart?" "Husband," she began, her voice even and calm, "there is something you need to know about what happened yesterday." And then she told him. She told him everything. She recounted the polite request of David's 10 young men. She recounted his own vicious, insulting response. She described the 400 men, armed for battle, who had marched on their estate to fulfill a vow of annihilation. And she described her own journey into the valley and the great gift she had been forced to give away to appease David's wrath and save all their lives. She laid out the cost, the 200 loaves of fine bread, the 2 skins of his best wine, the 5 sheep, the grain, the figs, the raisins. A small fortune given away to avert the disaster he had created. As she spoke, Nabal slowly lifted his head. He stared at her, his bloodshot eyes widening. His mind, sluggish from alcohol and clouded by arrogance, began to process the information. He wasn't hearing a lecture. He was hearing a sequence of events that pierced his thick skull with two terrifying realities. First, the sheer, mortal danger he had been in. The image of 400 warriors descending on his house to slaughter him was a vision of terror his mind could barely comprehend. Second, and perhaps even more horrifying to a man like him, was the thought of the property he had lost. The gift, the sheer volume of wealth that his wife had just given away, his precious, hoarded, beloved property. The twin shocks of mortal terror and financial loss were a cataclysmic blow to his system. As Abigail finished her story, a strange transformation came over him. The florid, red color drained from his face, leaving it a pasty, grayish white. The sneer on his lips went slack. He tried to speak, to bellow, to curse her for giving away his things, but only a strangled gurgle came out. His eyes, which a moment before had been filled with hungover irritation, glazed over, becoming dull and vacant. The scripture says, his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. He had suffered a massive stroke, or a heart attack, or some catastrophic combination of both. He slumped in his chair, no longer a blustering fool, but a paralyzed, speechless lump of flesh. The man with a heart of stone had become a man of stone. For 10 days, a strange and somber quiet fell over the great house. Nabal lived, but he was no longer there. He was an invalid, a living statue, a silent, breathing monument to his own folly. Abigail became the undisputed head of the household, her authority now absolute. She nursed him not out of affection, but out of duty, all the while managing the vast estate and its terrified servants with her customary grace and efficiency. It was a strange, grim period of limbo. And then, about 10 days after his collapse, the final judgment came. The Bible tells it plainly. The Lord struck Nabal, and he died. It was not a random medical event. It was the final, quiet verdict on a life lived in foolish rebellion against the principles of kindness, generosity, and wisdom. The story of Nabal the fool was over. Word of Nabal's death traveled, as all news does, and eventually it reached David's camp in the wilderness of Paran. When David heard it, he did not rejoice in the death of his enemy. Instead, he looked up to heaven, his heart filled with a profound sense of awe at the perfect and intricate justice of God. "Praise be to the Lord," he said to his men, his voice full of wonder, "who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt." He saw it clearly now. God had been his champion. He continued, "He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." It was a moment of deep theological insight for David. He saw that God had avenged him, so that he did not have to avenge himself. He saw that God had protected his integrity by sending Abigail to stop him. And then, in his own time and in his own way, he had delivered justice to Nabal. It was a powerful lesson. Leave vengeance to God, for his justice is perfect and his timing is flawless. And as David reflected on this, his thoughts turned once again to the agent of his salvation, the wise and courageous woman who had been the instrument of God's mercy. Abigail, the widow of Nabal, a pearl of great price, now free from the swine who had owned her. A new thought, a new plan began to form in David's mind. It was born of admiration, of strategic wisdom, and of a sense of divine providence. He was in awe of her character. He knew that marrying the wealthy and respected widow of a great Calebite landowner would strengthen his position in Judah immensely. And more than anything, it simply felt right. It felt like God's will. The Lord had removed the foolish husband to make this remarkable woman available. It felt like a reward, a blessing for having listened to her wise counsel. So David sent for his most trusted servants. This time, it was not a group of 10 young men asking for bread. It was a formal, dignified delegation sent on a mission of the highest importance. They journeyed to Carmel and presented themselves at the house of the widow Abigail. Eliam, the faithful servant, brought them before her. The messengers bowed and delivered their message from the future king of Israel. "David has sent us to you," the lead emissary said, "to take you to him to be his wife." Abigail listened, and her response was one of staggering humility. The wealthy mistress of a vast estate, a woman who could have lived out her days as a powerful and independent widow, did not act like a prize to be won. Instead, she bowed down with her face to the ground. From the dust, she spoke words that revealed the true depth of her character. "Here is your maidservant," she said, her voice clear and sincere. "I am ready to serve you and to wash the feet of my Lord's servants." To offer to wash the feet of the servants was to claim the lowest, most humble position in the entire household. It was a radical statement of submission, not to David the man, but to the Lord's anointed, the one whom God had chosen. Her decision was made. The scripture tells us, once again, that Abigail acted quickly. There was no hesitation. She was leaving behind a life of wealth and misery for a future of uncertainty, but also of purpose and hope. She got ready, and accompanied by her 5 personal female attendants, she mounted her donkey. She left the house of Nabal for the last time and followed David's messengers south into the wilderness. She became David's wife. She traded a stone mansion in the fertile hills of Carmel for a tent in the stark wilderness of Paran. She exchanged the company of a rich fool for the company of a poor man of God. She left a life of lonely splendor for a life of shared purpose. And so our story ends. It is the story of a foolish man whose wealth could not save him from his own character. It is the story of a great man on the verge of a terrible sin, saved by a moment of humility. And most of all, it is the story of Abigail, a woman of intelligence and beauty, of wisdom and courage, whose faithful actions ripple through history. She saved her household. She saved the conscience of a king. And she found her own destiny, not through ambition, but through humble, courageous, and decisive wisdom. It's a good story to hold on to as you drift off to sleep. A reminder that in a world full of angry, foolish noise, a single voice of calm, discerning wisdom can change everything. Sleep well, my friend.